Hey guys, Elias here, and it's been a while, I think. Yeah, today I'm gonna show you some stuff I've been doing, especially working on PhysicMaterials because I think that's an area of Unity that most people just ignore or don't have much knowledge about, and it can solve some very nasty problems when you try to create a game with a physics-based player. So, real quick, I'm just gonna introduce my player, how my player works. I think that's a very common setup. This is my player. It has a couple components. First, a capsule collider, which is normal. I think it's standard. A rigid body, which I use for collision detection, but mainly to move the player, since it's a physics-based character. And the character movement. Character movement has stuff like ground detection to detect when I'm grounded, and of course movement. This script uses forces to move the player. It applies forces directly to the rigid body. What that means is if I'm not adding any inputs, if I'm not moving the player, if I'm not pressing any buttons, no forces are applied to the player except gravity. Okay, so because of that, when you use this kind of player, you have to pay serious attention to the physics materials attached to it. And physics materials on Unity has basically 5 variables: the dynamic friction, the static friction, the bounciness, and how do you combine these values. Because basically when you collide with anything, this friction combined and bounce combined, they use the values from both the player and what it is colliding with to determine the friction and the bounciness. Okay, so in this case my player uses average for friction and minimum for bounce. What that means is when I'm calculating friction, I'm using the average between the player and the material I'm colliding with. And when I'm trying to calculate the bounciness of the collision, I use the minimum between the two. So if my bounciness is 0 and the other one is, for example, 0.5, it uses 0. My friction, if mine is 0 and the other is 0.5, I use 0.25, which is the average. Or if mine is 0, the other is 1, I use 0.5, and so on and so forth. So when you try to create the player, okay, and you don't worry about any of this, what happens is the way Unity is set up. I'm gonna play this real quick. By the way, this is my new project, Gloria. I'm trying a new art style, see if it works. What happens is when you jump into a wall like this, you should stick to it, but somehow it's not happening. Let me see if this other wall. I think maybe because I fixed that one already. Yeah, this is what happens when you only use the Unity setup. Okay, you jump to a wall and you get attached to it unless you release the button. When you release the input button, gravity acts. Gravity is the only force, and you go down. This happens because the static friction is too high. So in order to start the movement, gravity alone is not enough. Gravity plus the input you have right now my input is towards the wall, okay? So because of that, I'm colliding with the wall. If you don't know a lot about physics, you should know that dynamic and static friction, they are calculated based on the normal, which is the direction of the collision. So since I'm inputting towards the wall, my input is towards the wall, I'm applying a force towards the wall because that's how my input works. I'm applying a force towards the wall, and the wall is applying a normal towards me, and that's increasing the static friction. So only when I release the button, gravity is the only force acting, and I go down. How do I solve this problem? Okay, to solve this problem easily, I usually what you do is you remove all the friction on the player, right? So let's do this. I'll go to my player, physic material, and I'm gonna remove the static friction with 0 on it, okay? And I put minimum here on friction combined. So now I'm always gonna use 0 as my static friction. And if you play now, this wall is already fixed as I showed, but I'm gonna use the one that I didn't fix. You see that now I slide down, no problem, okay? But that causes another problem, which is on ramps. Now when you are on a ramp, look what happens. You start sliding down it. Why does this happen? Well, that's simple, because now gravity is the only force acting on the player. And when you are on a ramp and there's no static friction anymore, you just slide down, being moved by gravity. Okay, so that's another problem we have to solve. How do we do this? And that's thankfully the last one. Well, so the player definitely should use static friction. Okay, that's something you cannot escape. So he has to have one static friction and using average again. Okay, so I'm gonna average both of them. So how I'm doing this? Well, I have a player and I create a default physic material. A physic material that is going to be applied to any objects where this guy right here on the collider is not assigned. For example, if I put none, so then this default material is the one used. How do I do this? I go to on the Unity window. I go to Edit, Project Settings, Physics, and here Default Material. I add my default right here. Okay, so this is the default material that will be used, the default physics material that will be used in case this variable is not assigned. So since this is my player, I'm gonna assign my player right now. So my default now is 0 for all 3 values and average on both. Okay, the player is 1 in static friction and average on the friction combined, which means that now when I collide my player with any object that has a default material, I will use a 0.5 static friction because it's my value is 1, the value of the other collider is 0, and on the player I'm using average. So 0 plus 1 divided by 2, which is the average, is half. Okay, and I create a physic material specific to the ramp with static friction value equals 2. What happens is when the player, and now I'm gonna go to my ramp right here, okay, and on the material on the collider of the ramp, I will assign the ramp. Now what happens is when the player collides with any other object, the friction calculation will be half, okay, because it's average and my normal static friction is 1. So when I collide with something with a static friction 0, the result will be half. But when the player collides with the ramp, the static friction of the ramp is 2. So the player calculation will be 1 plus 2, 3, divided by 2, 1.5, more than 1. So in summarizing it all, when the player collides with another object, the static friction is half. When the player collides to a ramp, the static friction is 1.5. And this basically solves all the problems. You will see that when I'm on a ramp now, I don't slide down anymore. And when I'm forcing myself against a wall, I don't get stuck to it. I don't get attached to it. I don't get stuck anymore. So this is a little bit of what physic materials can do, and I hope you guys took something away from this. And yeah, so start paying attention to your physics materials, especially if you use a lot of physics in your game, especially if you use a physics-based character, because most of this don't require really a lot of stuff to do. It's only basic configuration, and that should work fine. Okay guys, that's pretty much it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I hope I can come back with some more updates on this new game, Gloria. And I see you next time. See you.